Story 1. The Mirror from the Antique Store. This story is about a young student named Sarah, who purchases an antique mirror from a quaint little shop. At first, the mirror seems like a charming addition to her apartment, but soon she begins to notice that her reflection behaves in ways it shouldn't. Subtle at first, the mirror's sinister nature gradually reveals itself, leading Sarah to uncover a dark and twisted history surrounding its previous owners. The truth that the mirror holds is not just unsettling but also deadly, and Sarah finds herself trapped in a nightmare that she never could have imagined. I didn't believe in the supernatural, at least not before the mirror. It all started on a Saturday afternoon, just like any other, when I wandered into an old antique shop on the corner of 5th and Maple. The kind of place that smells like dust and history, where the air is thick with the weight of forgotten objects. I had passed by the shop 100 times before, never giving it much thought, but that day something drew me inside. I was living in a small apartment at the time, just off campus, trying to fill it with things that made it feel like a home. College had been isolating in its own way. New city, new people, all of it was overwhelming. Decorating my space was a way of taking control. That's why when I saw the mirror, I knew I had to have it. It stood tall, with a gold frame tarnished from years of neglect. Delicate carvings of twisting vines and flowers lined the edges, giving it an ornate, almost regal appearance. The glass was slightly clouded, not so much that it distorted your reflection, but enough to make it seem as though something was hiding behind it. It was beautiful in a way that only old things can be, carrying a sense of mystery and age, like it had witnessed centuries of life pass by. The old man behind the counter noticed me lingering in front of it. "Ah, you've got a good eye," he said, his voice gravelly with age. "That mirror's been here a while. It's unique." He didn't elaborate on what made it unique, but I didn't care. I was sold. The price was surprisingly low for something that looked like it belonged in a museum, but I didn't question it. In hindsight, maybe I should have. I left the shop with the mirror that day, feeling a strange sense of excitement. There was something special about it, something that felt like it was meant to be mine. I had no idea that by bringing it into my home, I was inviting something else in too. The first few days were uneventful. I hung the mirror on the wall opposite my bed, where it reflected the entire room. It made the space feel bigger, brighter. I'd often catch myself glancing into it as I moved about, enjoying the way it seemed to change the atmosphere of the room. But then things started to shift. It began subtly, in ways that were easy to dismiss. I'd look into the mirror and feel like something was off, but I couldn't quite place what. My reflection seemed delayed just by a fraction of a second, almost as though it was thinking before mimicking my movements. Once I brushed it off as a trick of the light. Twice I convinced myself I was tired. By the third time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, as I was lying in bed, I saw it, my reflection moving when I wasn't. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the mirror stood up slowly while I remained perfectly still. It walked toward the edge of the mirror's frame, but when it reached the edge, it didn't stop. It stepped out. I blinked and everything was normal again. My reflection was back where it should be, lying in bed just like I was. I stared at the mirror for what felt like hours, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Stress. From classes, maybe. It was easier to believe that than to accept the alternative. Over the next week, the occurrences became more frequent. I'd see movements out of the corner of my eye, reflections that didn't match my own. The reflection would blink when I hadn't, or tilt its head in a direction I hadn't moved. I began avoiding looking into the mirror directly, but it was impossible to escape entirely. No matter where I was in the room, I could feel it watching me. One night, as I was preparing for bed, I caught a glimpse of something new. My reflection was wearing a different outfit, an old-fashioned dress, the kind you'd see in black and white photographs. It wasn't me, and yet it was. I could feel the cold sweat forming on my skin as I backed away from the mirror, but the reflection didn't move with me. Instead, it stayed in place, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I panicked, grabbing a sheet and throwing it over the mirror. Out of sight, out of mind, right? But the feeling of being watched never went away. Even with the mirror covered, I could feel something lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to step back into view. That night, I had a dream, though it felt more like a memory. I was standing in front of the mirror, only it wasn't my apartment. The room was dimly lit by candlelight, the wallpaper peeling with age. A woman stood behind me, her face obscured by shadows. She whispered something, but I couldn't make out the words. When I turned to face her, the mirror shattered and I woke up in a cold sweat. The next morning, I decided to return the mirror. I didn't care how beautiful it was or how much I'd paid for it. I needed it out of my life. But when I called the antique shop, the number was disconnected. I went back to the store in person, only to find that it was closed, boarded up like it hadn't been in business for years. There was no sign of the old man, no trace of the store I had been in just days before. I was stuck with the mirror. As the days went on, the dreams became more vivid, more violent. Each time, the woman in the reflection grew clearer. She had long dark hair and her eyes were hollow, filled with the sorrow that made my chest ache. In the dreams, she'd reach out for me, her fingers cold and skeletal, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. I knew she was trying to tell me something, but the words were always lost before I could understand. It wasn't long before the dreams began bleeding into reality. I'd hear whispers in the middle of the day, feel a cold breeze brush against my skin even when the windows were closed. The mirror became a constant presence in my life, no longer just a reflection, but a gateway to something darker. One evening, as I was sitting in my room, the air felt heavy, suffocating. I glanced at the covered mirror, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw the fabric move, like something was shifting beneath it. My heart raced, and before I could stop myself, I pulled the sheet away. The mirror was empty. No reflection, no room behind me. Just a black, endless void. The darkness in the mirror seemed to pulse, alive and beckoning. For a moment I stood frozen, staring into the void that had replaced my reflection. It was as though the mirror had become a window into some otherworldly abyss. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. A faint whisper began to rise from the depths of the mirror. It wasn't in English or any language I could recognize, but the tone sent shivers down my spine. The voice was low, soft, but insistent. It called out, echoing through the room even though the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I took a step back, suddenly feeling dizzy. My head was spinning, my vision blurred. I blinked hard, trying to refocus, but when I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in my room anymore. I stood in a large, dimly lit chamber. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes watching me as I moved. At the center of the room stood a figure, the woman from my dreams. She wore the same old-fashioned dress, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her pale face. Her hollow eyes met mine, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones. She didn't speak, but I could feel her thoughts pressing into my mind, a desperate plea for help. She raised a bony hand and pointed to a large mirror on the opposite wall. It was identical to the one in my apartment, except this one was cracked down the middle. The glass splintered and jagged. Suddenly, the woman moved toward the mirror, her feet gliding soundlessly across the floor. As she approached the fractured glass, I saw something horrifying. Inside the mirror, trapped within the cracks, were faces, dozens of them, men, women, children. Their expressions were frozen in terror, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with fear. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as the woman's reflection stared at me from within the broken mirror. She raised her hand again, this time pointing directly at me. I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. It took me a few moments to realize I was back in my apartment, back in my own world. The mirror across from me was still there, the sheet draped over it once again. I shuddered. The images from the dream. Or was it something more? Still fresh in my mind. I didn't dare go near the mirror for the rest of the day. I avoided my room altogether, preferring to study in the library. surrounded by people. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy, as though the world around me was on the verge of splitting apart. At night, I decided I needed answers. I wasn't a superstitious person, but whatever was happening to me wasn't normal. The mirror, whatever it was, had a history, a past that I needed to understand if I ever wanted to escape its grasp. I started with the local historical society, hoping to find some record of the antique shop or the mirror's origins. After several hours of searching through old property records and newspapers, I found something. The shop had once been owned by a man named William Farrow, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1937. Before his disappearance, there had been reports of strange occurrences at the shop. Whispers in the night, objects moving on their own, and most disturbingly, several accounts of customers who had purchased items and never been seen again. One article mentioned a particularly curious case involving a young woman who had bought a mirror from Farrow's shop in the 1920s. Her name was Elizabeth Hawthorne, and according to the article, she had vanished just days after purchasing the mirror. Her family reported that in the days leading up to her disappearance, Elizabeth had been acting strangely, claiming that her reflection was no longer her own, and that she was being haunted by visions of the past. My blood ran cold. The mirror. It had to be the same one. I hurried back to my apartment, my heart racing. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city streets. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. By the time I reached my building, I was practically running. Inside my apartment, the air was thick with tension. The mirror loomed in the corner of the room, still covered by the sheet. I hesitated for a moment, but I knew what I had to do. I pulled the sheet off the mirror, and for the first time I examined it closely. There was something etched into the frame, hidden beneath layers of grime and dust. I rubbed at the surface, revealing a series of symbols, strange, intricate markings that I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, like something out of an old occult manuscript. As I traced my fingers over the carvings, I felt a jolt, like an electric shock, run through my body. The mirror began to vibrate, the glass rippling as though it were made of water. I stumbled back, my pulse quickening, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. In the reflection, the room was no longer mine. It had changed, just like in my dreams. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture old and worn, and there, standing in the center of the room, was the woman. Her face was clear now, pale, gaunt, her eyes dark and hollow. She stepped toward the glass, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was pushing through some invisible barrier. I could see her lips moving, though no sound escaped. Suddenly, the room around me began to warp. The walls shifted, the floor buckled. I felt a tug, as though something was pulling me toward the mirror. Panic surged through me as I tried to move, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The woman reached out, her hand pressing against the glass from the other side. The mirror rippled again, and I could feel the cold emanating from it, creeping into the room, into my skin. I realized then that the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, and whatever was on the other side wanted me. The pull grew stronger, and I struggled to resist. My body felt heavy, as though invisible hands were dragging me toward the mirror. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, echoing in my ears, filling my mind with fragments of forgotten memories. Memories that weren't mine. And the faces of the trapped souls flashed before my eyes, their hollow gazes pleading for release. I saw flashes of their lives, their final moments, their terror as they were pulled into the mirror, consumed by the darkness within. I wasn't gonna be the next one. With a surge of adrenaline, I reached for the sheet and threw it over the mirror, blocking out the dark reflection. The room snapped back into focus, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for me to breathe again. I collapsed onto the floor, trembling, but I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't stay in the apartment. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and left. As I closed the door behind me, I heard the faintest whisper, a final warning from the depths of the mirror. "We'll be waiting." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman's face staring back at me, hollow and pleading. The images of the trapped souls haunted me, their silent screams echoing in my mind. I spent hours pacing back and forth in a cheap motel room I had checked into, trying to piece together what had happened and, more importantly, what I was going to do next. I couldn't return to the apartment, not while that mirror was still there. It wasn't just an ordinary antique. It was something far darker, something that had taken people before and would take me too if I wasn't careful. Morning brought no comfort. The sun, weak and pale, barely filtered through the thin motel curtains, and I felt no safer than I had in the dead of night. My mind was spinning with questions, none of which had easy answers. What had I really bought? How was it connected to the shop owner's disappearance? And why was that woman, Elizabeth Hawthorne, so desperately trying to communicate with me? I knew I needed help. This was far beyond anything I could handle on my own. I thought about going to the police, but what could I possibly tell them? That my reflection was haunting me, that my mirror was a doorway to some other world. They'd think I was crazy. And maybe I was. But then I remembered something. In the newspaper archives, I had come across the name of a local historian who specialized in paranormal occurrences in the area. His name was Samuel Wright, and from the looks of his records, he had written extensively about strange, unexplained phenomena in the city. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was him. I found his contact information and called his office. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Samuel Wright. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. My name is Rachel. I think I need your help. I met with Samuel at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. He was older than I expected, in his late 60s maybe, with thinning gray hair and sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to size me up the moment I sat down. I told him everything. The mirror, the dreams, the whispers, the trapped souls. To his credit, he listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally as if what I was saying wasn't entirely unfamiliar to him. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You're not the first person to have a run-in with that mirror, he said finally, his voice low. I've heard rumors about it for years, but nothing concrete. Until now. What is it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It's not just a mirror. And Samuel said, his eyes narrowing, it's a conduit, a gateway, if you will, to a place beyond this world. But it's not just any place. It's a prison. The souls trapped inside aren't just lost. They were taken, one, by the mirror's previous owners. My heart sank. You mean I could be next? Samuel nodded grimly. If you don't act fast, yes. The mirror has a way of luring its owners in, feeding on their fear and curiosity until it traps them for good. The woman you saw, Elizabeth Hawthorne, she was one of them. From what you've it sounds like she's been trying to warn you, trying to help you avoid her fate. I felt a chill run down my spine. How do I stop it? How do I get rid of it? Samuel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You can't destroy it, not without releasing the souls inside, which could be even more dangerous. But you can seal it. There's an old ritual, a way to bind the mirror so it can't claim any more lives. How do I do it? That evening, I stood in front of the mirror once again, this time in the dim light of dusk. I had returned to my apartment to perform the ritual Samuel had given me, my hands trembling as I arranged the candles and herbs in a circle around the mirror. The air felt thick with tension, as though the mirror itself was aware of what I was about to do. I took a deep breath and lit the candles, the soft flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The mirror remained covered, but I could feel its presence, as though it was watching me from behind the sheet. I began to recite the words Samuel had taught me, my voice shaky but determined. The ancient language felt foreign on my tongue, each syllable thick with the weight of centuries of forgotten knowledge. As I spoke, the room grew colder. The candles flickered violently, the flames bending and twisting as though caught in a fierce wind. The sheet over the mirror began to stir, as if something beneath it was struggling to break free. I kept reciting, louder now, forcing the words out, even as the temperature continued to drop. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air in the room turning icy. The mirror began to hum, a low, eerie vibration that resonated through my chest, shaking the floor beneath my feet. Suddenly, the sheet was ripped off the mirror by an invisible force. The glass shimmered, dark and alive, and for a brief moment I saw them. The faces, the trapped souls. Elizabeth Hawthorne among them, her face etched with the same hollow desperation I'd seen in my dreams. They reached out, their mouths moving in silent pleas for release. But I couldn't help them. Not yet. With a final desperate shout, I finished the incantation. The candles flared, their flames shooting high into the air before abruptly extinguishing. The room plunged into darkness, the only light now coming from the mirror itself, which pulsed with a faint, ethereal glow. And then silence. The mirror was still. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. But nothing happened. No voices, no whispers. Just an eerie, oppressive quiet. Slowly I approached the mirror, my hand shaking as I reached out and touched the glass. It was cold, lifeless. The ritual had worked. In the weeks that followed, I moved out of the apartment. I couldn't stay there. Not after everything that had happened. The mirror remained sealed, hidden away in a storage facility far outside the city, where it would hopefully be forgotten. I still have nightmares sometimes. Elizabeth's face haunts me, her eyes filled with sorrow and regret. But I know that for now the mirror is no longer a threat. I can only hope it stays that way. Because somewhere, deep inside the glass, those trapped souls are still waiting. And one day, the mirror might find someone new.